listening to Not Crazy, a Psych Central podcast, hosted by my ex-husband who has bipolar disorder. Together, we created the mental health podcast for people who hate mental health podcasts.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to the Not Crazy podcast. My name is Gabe Howard, and I'm your host. And with me, as always, is Lisa Kiner. Lisa!
Hey, everyone. Today's quote comes to us from Ryanushuk Satoru, and he said, "Individually, we are one drop. Together, we are an ocean."
I like quotes like this for so many reasons, but there's lots of quotes like this, right? You know, just like...
It translates nicely into a poster.
Yeah. Wait, do you have the kitten doing the hang in there thing?
I love that one. That's my favorite.
But isn't it so overdone?
Yeah, but it's a kitten.
But isn't like the stronger together thing overdone as well?
Together, everyone achieves more.
Together, everyone does achieve more. And what makes me sad is not the glurgy nature of the quotes or the simplicity of it or just the of it. It's the fact that we don't know this. Like, do we really need a poster or a quote to tell us this? Is this not just like basic common sense? Like, why don't we have a quote that says, hey, if you hold your breath, you'll die?
Good point. I'd never actually thought about that. Why do we have all these quotes? And the answer is because, yes, people do actually need it.
We also need a place for kittens hanging off stuff to get work.
Good point. Otherwise, what jobs are they really qualified for?
They could just be our little cuddlies.
Good idea.
I think it's a good idea. You know, Lisa, we get mail. We get mail, comments.
And we appreciate all of it.
We do. Thank you, everybody. And one of the things that keeps coming up is they ask us why our guests never share personal stories. And in fact, they referenced us saying, hey, we don't have guests on to share personal stories. We'd rather debate a subject or discuss something or share their point of view. And the question specifically came up, so are you saying that personal stories are bad? Are they stupid? Do you not like them? And first, I want to say unequivocally, if I couldn't share my personal story, I would not have a podcast.
Good point. You're sharing your story constantly. It's a job description.
So there's this little piece of me that thinks, hey, we made the decision because I don't want the competition.
Good one.
That is not, in fact, why I made the decision. The reality is personal stories are extremely valuable, and I encourage all of you to share. They're just so well represented in the space. But you know what's not well represented in the space? The opinions of people living with mental health issues and mental illness. I want to tell people what I want. I don't want to tell them my story and hope that on the strength of my story, they get it. You should not treat me like shit. Why not? Because I am a person and deserving of respect. Rather than, you should not treat me like shit. Why not? Hang on, let me tell you a story of when somebody treated me like shit and it made me feel bad. We wanted to get into why we develop these opinions and how we want the world to follow us.
So you don't want people to have to infer what you mean. You want to just tell them.
Oh yeah, that's a much faster way of saying that.
Well, if it were up to me, it'd be a lot shorter show.
So Lisa and I decided that we would invite our good friend Rachel Steinman over to discuss the power of storytelling. Rachel is the host of the Dear Family podcast. She's an awesome mental health advocate, and she knows a lot about getting people to share their stories and, of course, the value of that. So Rachel, welcome to the show.
So nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, as I just mentioned, you are the host of the Dear Family podcast. Can you briefly tell our listeners what that is?
Sure. It is a podcast where we celebrate our complicated families. We find mental wellness, and I interview inspirational people who have overcome obstacles. And we talk a lot about family members that have mental illness or people that have mental illness and how they've overcome it or how they're dealing with it. And we also talk about family secrets and the importance of just sharing stories and having open dialogue to rid stigma and shame and find love and compassion and understanding.
And Rachel, that's exactly why we wanted to have you on the show. We're all mental health advocates. And in this case, we're all podcasters, which is kind of rare for us. It's a unique occurrence, right, Lisa? We don't have a lot of podcasters on our podcast.
Oh, so meta.
I just wanted to set you up to use meta.
I know. I have to use that at least once an episode.
But Rachel, we're all mental health advocates, but we go about it very differently. Lisa and I believe very strongly in people with lived experience sort of viewing the world and translating it for people who haven't been there. And you believe very strongly in people sharing their stories and talking about what happened to them. And what I really like about your podcast is you really, really dig deep. It's not fluff. It's like you said, it's no secrets. You dig into the family. There's just a lot of debate about which one is right. And I kind of think it's a stupid debate because I think they're both right.
Well, I definitely appreciate your platform and I can see why it's so important. But I'm coming at it from a daughter whose mother has bipolar, whose grandparents both died by suicide, whose brother was addicted to crystal meth and ended up homeless. And all these years of shame and no one really talking about mental illness, I wanted to change that narrative. I wanted to openly talk about it because I don't want to pass this on to my daughters. I don't want that generational trauma continuing. If we don't talk about it, then that shame may continue or they may not feel comfortable speaking out. This really all began when I started writing, and I wrote an essay called Grandpa and Anthony Bourdain. And it was after Anthony Bourdain took his life by suicide. And I talked about my family. And so many people, private messages or publicly, came out of the woodwork that I had known from high school and on and said, I had no idea that you had that family. You hid it so well. I have something similar, or my mom or my brother or my husband or myself. And I realized literally everyone has a family member dealing with a mental health issue, or they themselves are dealing with it. And let's talk about it.
How specifically do you feel that telling these stories of other folks living with mental illness is helping people who do not live with mental illness?
I think it's hugely helpful. I have heard, and I love hearing this, and I'm sure you hear this, that it really helps others find compassion for those that are suffering and maybe even find compassion for themselves. And that there's no shame in asking for help or seeking therapy or talking about it. The more we talk about it, the more others talk about it, right? Truth begets more truth. And my mom has bipolar. She was not diagnosed until her mid 60s. And for all those years, I was ashamed of my mom. I was embarrassed by her eccentricities and her vulgarity and her swinging moods. And now that I understand that it truly is a mental health disorder and it affects her brain, I have so much more compassion. And it's made my mom and I so much closer.
And then how does your mom feel about that? How does she feel about you telling her story? Is she okay with that?
Well, at first she was not. At first, actually, when I started writing essays, because that's how it began, she was not thrilled about it. She also saw things differently. And I think at one point it pushed her into a manic episode, which did not help. And then I felt guilty and there was definitely some tension because, of course, here I am sharing her story publicly. Is it really fair for me to do that? Maybe not, to be honest. But then after my mom started reading them and realizing that there was value in sharing the story, she actually came to me and I'm so grateful. And she gave me her blessing. And she said, "You're doing what I wish I could have done. If our story can help one person, then you have my blessing." And I have to say, what a beautiful gift.
How long would you say that took between the time when you started and when your mom came around?
Not too long. I would say about a year. And I wanted my mom to be my first podcast guest because my podcast is called Dear Family. And she said, absolutely not. I don't like my voice. I'm not interesting. All of these excuses. But I didn't push it and I ended up having my brother. But my mom ended up being my 50th episode and it was so special. She was so open. She's come so far. So in a way, I think me having this platform made her realize the importance of her voice and the importance of sharing her story.
Thank you for being so candid about telling your family story, because this is something that I struggle with, not with my family because they're okay with it. We apparently just have no scruples whatsoever. But the other people around me, I am surprised that sometimes I'll see things on Facebook or I'll get emails from somebody that I knew way back when, and they'll be like, I heard this on the podcast or I read this in a blog that you wrote, and I knew you were talking about me and I don't like it. Take it down. Now, I don't mention people's names. I remove identifying stuff, but even though nobody could possibly figure out it was them from it, they knew it. And that was enough to really make them anxious or fearful or angry. How do you get around that with other folks? Because with your family, hey, you're a member of your family and you've made a decision. But what about like a friend, or if you saw your mom interact with somebody else and you're like, well, this is a story that's worth telling, what my mom did to the store clerk, for example. And I'm just literally making stuff up, because while you're okay telling your mom's story, are you okay telling the store clerk's story? And does it still have value? Is it just, hey, these are paparazzi rules, it happened in public?
I want to answer your question, but I have a question first for you. Did you end up taking it down?
No.
Okay, good.
I never did. No, of course not. And thank you for asking that follow-up question. I didn't take it down because, hey, one, I made sure that they couldn't be identified, and plus, this is just life. And three, they did it. But moving all of that aside, where does that end? I mean, how much retconning of the past can I possibly do? How much editing? How much revisionist history? I mean, if I can start revising my past, I mean, I'm going to take aim at other things. Yeah, but I did feel bad. It did make me feel uncomfortable, this idea that I was drudging up unhappiness for this person. I chalked it up to collateral damage, but how reasonable is that?
This all began when I was 40 years old, and it was 24 years after my grandfather had died by suicide. My grandfather was a big real estate mogul in Manhattan. He had, to, the outside world, a perfect life. He had kids, he had grandkids, he had money in the bank, he was traveling, he had his physical health to still golf and play tennis. And yet he jumped out of his 14th floor balcony, actually, and died by suicide. I was 16 at the time. 24 years later, when I turned 40, his third wife passed away, and I was allowed back into this high rise. And I found his unfinished manuscript. His father died by suicide. His brother died by suicide. And his wife, so that would be my maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, also died by suicide when my mom was just 14. And no one ever talked about it. I found this manuscript and it blew me away, but it was incomplete. There was a lot that was never said, especially the really important things. There was a lot of business acumen and all of that talked about, but what I was really searching for was missing. It set me on this journey to become his ghostwriter, and I started finishing his story, and I realized I had a story to tell, and I am still working on this double memoir that spans 5 generations. But as I was writing it, I'm digging all this dirt. I'm talking about my family like you cannot believe, right? Talk about opening up a can of worms. My uncles, my mom, my dad, my childhood, my life, things I did that wasn't right. But if you want to be authentic, you have to tell the truth. And this is my truth. I ended up writing this essay. Well, my family on the East Coast got back to me and were very upset, very angry with me. How dare you talk about grandpa or my dad that way? They're very upset with me. Fortunately, Medium has kind of like an RSS feed. You can change it and it updates. I was able to just say grandpa and get rid of the last name, and that appeased them enough. But that was an awful feeling, knowing how upset my family was with me. And yet I totally stand by that essay to this day. I mean, if it's my truth, it's my truth.
So how does it turn out with your family now? Are they still upset about that, or have they also come around?
So I'm an open book. So is my mom. Some of the other family members are not. I also just recently, my cousin was upset about how I mentioned her dad. And yet I know deep in my soul, I can sleep at night because it's true. That's just kind of what I go on. And I don't know if all of them have come around. Maybe it's selfish of me to say, but I'm okay if they haven't.
How do you feel about the concept of it's true to you? I think about how I see people and, Lisa and I have this constant struggle and this constant debate about how Lisa sees her parents and how I see her parents. Now, they're not changing for me, for her. The difference is I knew her parents only as an adult and, obviously they don't like me very much. I divorced their daughter and there was a lot of turmoil. But in Lisa's case, they raised her, they birthed her. So when I say, well, your parents are mean, she's like, no, they're mean to you. So if
they're showing loyalty to me.
Right. So if I wrote an article called The True Story About Lisa's Parents, I wouldn't have to tell a single lie to make them look bad. But the reality is it's incomplete, right? I'm only telling the things that they did to me that I don't like, and I'm therefore, and I'm making air quotes, guys, speaking my truth. Do you think that people understand that? Do you think that when people read an article or listen to a podcast by Rachel or by Gabe or by Lisa, they understand that that is that person's take and that it's certainly possible and in fact likely that somebody else has a completely different take?
I love this question so much because I think that that's one of the things that writing taught me that helped me in podcasting is that you have to make the person you're interviewing a round character. They can't be flat. If someone read my article, they would find sympathy for my grandfather. It has to show both angles. So, Gabe, if you're writing an article about Lisa's parents, you need to include that part about how great they raised their daughter. Otherwise, it's not, again, that word authentic. It's not authentic. So one of the things that writing really helped me do is look at my grandparents, look at my mom, look at my brother, and not just see them as, oh, they just did this and they suck. It helps me look at the past. It helps me see how they were affected. My grandfather, his dad was a narcissist. He learned that from him. His dad died by suicide. Looking at someone as a three-dimensional character, finding compassion for them, understanding the history, understanding from where they came is such a better story. Like some of the best storytellers, there's a villain, and yet you can find sympathy for them.
Darth Vader. You're describing Darth Vader.
Right.
It was so sad when he died.
But he terrorized people for 3 movies, but then we saw him as this flawed character that got, I don't know, just
redemption.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess it's a redemption arc if we're using fiction words. I like what you said there, Rachel. The reality is this is an advanced life skill. People can be 2 things. I was very much angry about the divorce. I was angry that I'd caused more problems. And then, here's these other people, they're coming in and they're essentially shedding light on their truth, which is that I was a bad husband. So I didn't like that. Then in reality, I learned that, hey, they can be 2 things. They can both not be very nice to Gabe, which is, they're right, I guess. And
loyalty to me.
Exactly. And of course, they can be exceptional parents that gave me my best friend and the woman who saved my life. Well, now what do I do with that? And I think that people struggle with this. And I think this is, to your point, Rachel, why these stories are so important to get out there, not because of our versions of it, but because of the discussions that come up around them. See, right now, when it comes to, bipolar disorder and mental illness, especially in families, it's never being discussed. I actually think that it is a real bonus that the whole family is emailing you and calling you and telling you that you got it wrong, that you messed this up, that you're making us look bad. Because while that discussion may be aggressive or even angry and hostile, it may well be the first discussion that any member of your family has had about these events in potentially their entire lives. And I think that gets us to a good place.
I totally agree. The moment that happened, I thought this might be the first time they're all discussing this tragic event kind of with open eyes. What you said about the two sides, I actually think sometimes there's three sides. I think there's your side, their side, and the truth.
I like that. I like that.
And the other thing that I will point out, I think that is a huge saving grace is forgiveness. By seeing the true picture and being able to step back, you are able to look at your family members' past and find forgiveness. And that is so healing, taking that weight off your shoulders. I was able to forgive my mom for things that she did because I was able to understand that was her bipolar. My mom was able to forgive me for separating and pushing away from her because that was my coping mechanism. Having these conversations and being able to find that compassion leads to forgiveness. And I think if you can forgive, it's your gift.
We'll be back in a minute after these messages.
Interested in learning about psychology and mental health from experts in the field? Give a listen to the Psych Central podcast, hosted by Gabe Howard. Visit psychcentral.com/show or subscribe to the Psych Central podcast on your favorite podcast player.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp.com. Secure, convenient, and affordable online counseling. All counselors are licensed, accredited professionals. Anything you share is confidential. Schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist whenever you feel it's needed. A month of online therapy often costs less than a single traditional face-to-face session. Go to BetterHelp.com/PsychCentral and experience 7 days of free therapy to see if online counseling is right for you. BetterHelp.com/PsychCentral.
And we're back discussing the power of personal stories with podcaster Rachel Steinman.
Let's talk about the next step in the evolution of open discussion. Sorry.
I have a question.
I haven't asked mine yet.
Yeah. So do you feel that this has been beneficial to your family?
Absolutely. By me kind of opening up the can of worms, forcing some discussions. Like I said, my mom and I have never been closer. I was ready to kick my mom out of my life. She was just so erratic. And then once I started really digging deep, it helped me find that compassion and that understanding. It was almost like I put on new lenses and saw clearly for the first time. And I'm talking about going back multiple generations to my grandparents and to even their parents who I never knew, and seeing how this generational trauma can get passed down, how if you don't talk about it, it can fester. So yes, I'm so glad that I went on this journey. And if nothing else comes of this, which I don't believe is true, it saved our relationship.
I like what you said about seeing things clearly, but I still worry about how clearly changes. Again, I think about my own life, and I have probably the most ridiculous example of this. Are you familiar with the TV show King of the Hill?
Yes. I don't watch it, but I'm familiar with it.
I loved that. When it was on, I watched every episode when it was brand new. Now, when it was on, I was young. I think it premiered when I was like 17 years old, and it ended probably when I was around 23, 24. Now with COVID and we can't do anything, I decided to pop open Hulu and literally watch it from scratch. Now, for those that don't know, King of the Hill is about this conservative Texas family. This guy, his name is Hank Hill. He sells propane and propane accessories, and he's this real quiet guy who likes football. And his son, who's 12, is named Bobby Hill. Now, Bobby is the exact opposite. Talks a mile a minute. He's a chubby kid. He hates sports, and he's just a weird, funny little kid. And when I watched it the first time, I very much related to Bobby Hill, right? He's just trying to be who he is and make his way in the world and live his best life. I'm 43 years old now, and I watched the exact same show again. It didn't change one iota. And I'm watching it, and I just completely related to Hank Hill. Here's this guy who's trying to live his best life. He has a kid. He's got this idea in his head of what being a father is, and he doesn't know how to connect to his son, who's the exact opposite as him. And he's just desperately doing his best, and nothing seems to be working. It's the exact same show, Rachel. They didn't change anything. The only thing that changed is I got 20 years older. I think this is why openly discussing our stories and talking about them and keeping them in whether it's the public consciousness or the family consciousness, is so important. Because as Lisa and I have discussed a million times, our parents were dumb as shit when we were kids. And then the minute we turned about 35, we realized they were geniuses. That nothing changed.
So what you're saying is then part of the benefit is that you're able to reinterpret it with new eyes at a later time. I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Gabe.
I think the benefit is that age provides perspective. I could not see things the way that my parents saw things because I was not under the pressures that they were under. The reasons that my parents made the decisions they did when they were raising me is because, well, they had other children to think about. They had a mortgage. They had jobs. They had other responsibilities. Gabe had no understanding of that. I just thought that my dad thought that I was weird and didn't want to connect with me, and that's why I liked the Bobby. Well, once I became older and I had my own struggles with managing work and making friends and connecting to the children in my life, I realized that, oh, hey, it's not that my dad thought that I was a weird little kid that he didn't like. It's that my dad just had no idea how to connect with me either. And that's what I saw in Hank Hill. We often talk about things right when they happen because it's fresh and the crisis is right there. Can you believe mom did this? Can you believe Gabe said that? Can you believe this bad thing happened? And then we take the whole thing and we ball it up, and whatever age and place we were in the world is the only way we ever think about it for the rest of our lives. So however Rachel saw her grandfather's death at 16 becomes how she sees her grandfather's death for the rest of her life. But by discussing it, by seeing that manuscript, by talking to other family members, you start to realize that there were things that 16-year-old Rachel didn't know. Now, again, I'm speaking a lot for Rachel all of a sudden. What are your thoughts on that?
I interviewed a woman named Dani Shapiro. She's a New York Times bestseller, and she's incredible, and she's a memoirist, which it stayed with me. She talked about how when you write about trauma, you can't write about it right after it happens. The only people that can do that really are poets. You need time and space to look at things. I definitely agree with that, because if I had just thought about my grandfather the way I did when I was 16, and didn't understand why somebody would take their life when I thought they had everything, then I would still be stuck in that place of, in a way, feeling like he was selfish. And now, of course, I don't think of that at all. I understand how somebody could take their life. There's so much pain that you wake up every morning, you feel like, what's the point? And I never could have understood that at that age. Now, again, talking about how we change with age and there's that wisdom as we grow older. I remember looking at my parents too and thinking like that they're idiots, that they're idiots because they don't know. And I never want to be anything like them. And now I have teenage daughters. They will say things to me that I just laugh at, like, oh, you don't know, or you'll never understand, or things like that. And I know that in 15, 20 years, they're going to change the way they look at things. But yes, there is something really amazing about looking at things after having more experience. And I have to say, being a parent definitely changes things. I've talked about this. I was a kindergarten teacher straight out of college who used to judge parents because they didn't have time to read to their kids, or they would bribe their kid with candy. And I remember thinking, I will never do that. And then cut to, I have my own kids. And then I feel guilty for judging them. But I think that, yes, the importance of storytelling is to see different views from different ages, also to talk about it. So, for example, my mom now has a label. We know she's bipolar. Well, my girls know she's bipolar. She'll grow up looking at things differently than she would have had we not been able to talk so openly about it.
Okay. Let me say thank you real quick. Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate that.
Of course.
Oh, I didn't know that's what you were going to do. Okay. I thought you were going to say thank you for being here. I thought, why would you do that when I have a question? But I understand now. Never mind.
Rachel, I love so much that you don't have a co-host. Like that's how'd you set that up? You got to
see how much her life is lacking. Poor thing.
No,
that's
her
so
life
sad for you.
I'm just teasing.
Although you guys definitely seem to have fun together. And I love that. It's impressive.
I owe her a life debt. Like I'm
Like Chewbacca.
I keep trying to get away from her, but I'm not allowed.
She pulls you back in.
I mean, that part is kind of true.
I try.
Actually. In a way, we're joking, right? But as you know, Lisa and I, we are divorced, and that is unusual. They're like, well, if you're still friends and you like each other, why couldn't you be married? As if
We get that a lot.
As if marriage and friendship are identical things. But in a way, Lisa knows my whole story with mental illness. That makes her extraordinarily valuable. I think it's why people want to stay connected to their families so much, because your family knows like your entire childhood. Like that's a lot of bonding. I'm not trying to say that Lisa and I are only friends because she saved my life, but I think Lisa and I might only be friends because she saved my life. That's like an incredible thing to connect two people. It's hard to break. I mean, she also likes Star Wars, and that's pretty badass. And we like the same restaurants.
No, we don't.
That's true. We hate us trying to pick a
No, we
restaurant
just go there
is-
because you're too picky.
You will only eat at like these weird restaurants that even Yelp won't review.
Everything you pick is so boring.
And yet popular.
Anywho,
I love it.
Question for Rachel. Question for the person here. So you've talked about the importance of sharing your story publicly on a large scale, on a podcast or online or in an article. What about, do you feel there's any value in maybe something on a smaller scale, like sharing with your coworkers or talking to the person standing next to you at McDonald's?
Absolutely. I mean, that's probably the most powerful, right? Face to face, one-on-one. That's like a true connection. And sharing your story by being vulnerable, by opening up yourself, it lets other people take their guards down and open up to you. I say this all the time, but by showing how people can overcome obstacles, like I love highlighting people that have hit real low points, whether they were homeless or addicted to crack or whatever it is, and how they were able to ask for help, which feels weak, but is actually the strongest, bravest thing you can do, and then turn their life around. It's so inspirational. And all you need to hear is one story that can move you into action. So yes, definitely. I think that's so powerful, that one-on-one connection.
Lisa, I really liked your question. And Rachel, I did like your answer. I think that sometimes people believe that things only work on a grand scale. You know, if you can't have a podcast like Rachel or a podcast like Gabe and Lisa, or if you can't have a huge following in a newspaper but that's like so sad, right? I mean, could you imagine if Lisa would have seen something wrong with Gabe and instead of telling me her story or discussing with me, she would have just let it go and written a blog like that wouldn't have found me where I was. I wasn't searching out this information. So in that way, Lisa's one-on-one conversation was infinitely more valuable than even the most popular podcast, because I wouldn't have searched for it. I wouldn't have read it. I wouldn't have listened, connected. I thought that was for other people and not for me. And Lisa's one-on-one conversation with me connected to me where I was. I sincerely think in this age of, how many likes do we have? How many followers? How many hits? People forget that one-on-one conversations have just a tremendous amount of value, especially to the person that you're having it with.
You talking about the connecting one-on-one, it just made me think of a story about my husband, who is a entrepreneur, and he's been in the business world since out of college and has had some success. And I'm just very proud of him. And someone asked him who his mentor was and who he looked up to. And I would have come up with 10 other people. And he mentioned his mom's friend, this man named Myron, who he's had multiple conversations with quietly. And it really kind of blew me away that this one person made these connections. And it was the separate phone calls. And it just goes to show how reaching out and having those conversations one-on-one is so powerful. And I sometimes get private messages from people. And I have to say, look, I am not a therapist. I just have lived experience. But by me connecting one-on-one with them privately and making them feel like I do care about them and that they are important and that they can find help has been so impactful for me.
My sincere question is, it really seems like every single person who has a mental illness or knows somebody with a mental illness immediately thinks that they need to start a podcast, write a memoir, or a blog. And I don't want to stop anybody from following their dreams or putting their information out there. I'm just wondering if some of those people are doing it out of obligation or because they think that that's the only way and are missing out on other ways for them to share. One of the examples that comes to mind is somebody hosting a podcast right now that would much rather lead a support group. And instead of leading the support group, they believe that they have to reach more people. And therefore, even though they'd be an incredible support group facilitator, they're sitting behind a microphone and editing software miserable because after all, they're reaching more people.
There's probably countless podcasts dealing with mental wellness. I will say the fact that Lady Gaga and every celebrity now is talking about their anxiety or just look at TikTok and, the teenagers. I mean, it's almost like
it's very popular.
Cool to talk about what you're dealing with and struggling with, which, by the way, is fantastic that our kids are talking about it. But does everyone need to have a podcast? No, probably not. And that was partly why I wanted to make sure that my platform highlighted other people's stories, because it is important to get stories out there. But yes, I totally agree with you. I think that there are other platforms that people can share their stories without having to start a podcast. And yeah, absolutely. We do need more support groups, and we do need more probably like therapists, especially people of color. We need more cultural sensitivity training. And I would encourage that for sure if you are considering getting in the field and wanting to help.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here today. Where can our listeners find you?
So my website is Right Now Rachel. That's right with a W. And I am on all the social media platforms, and my podcast is on all the podcasting platforms. Just search Dear Family.
It's an awesome podcast. I highly recommend it. I hope you would check it out on your favorite podcast player or head over to rightnowrachel.com. Remember, it's right like you're writing.
Exactly. And I'm so excited because I'm having Gabe as a guest on my podcast coming up very soon. And we're going to talk all about him and his family.
Yay!
Yay!
Turnabout is always fair play. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. And listeners, stay tuned because now we're going to talk behind Rachel's back.
Awesome. I can't wait to hear this later.
It's like our favorite joke. We're going to talk about your behind your back.
It's not our favorite joke.
It's my favorite joke.
Why is Rachel interviewing you on the show and not me?
Well,
aren't we a package deal?
No. No, we're divorced.
Fair.
The package deal part of the Gabe and Lisa relationship has long since ended by rule of law. Could you imagine this poor woman? Like, she already spent a couple of hours in the studio with us to do this interview, and then we show up again on her show? For real.
Okay, there's a point. She was very patient with us.
Do we dislike people that much?
Not her specifically.
I'm the star.
You are. You're the star.
Lisa, we went back and forth a lot when we were designing our show about the personal stories. And I know that I felt a little hypocritical not letting the personal stories on it because that's literally my career. I share my story for a living. That's my keynote address. It's literally called This Bipolar Life. And it's about my life living with bipolar disorder. So I felt a skosh hypocritical, but at the same time, we looked around and there just wasn't any shows where people were just tackling life or the subject matter through the lens of people living with mental illness. I just want people with mental health issues and mental illness to tell people what they want, advocate for it and fight for it and not be ambiguous. I think that has just as much value as sharing our stories.
Of course it does, but why does it have to be one or the other? The whole point is we can have two approaches to this problem.
This is the most fascinating thing that we deal with on this show, where people hear that you advocate for one thing and they immediately believe that you are against something else. Could you imagine this playing out in the real world? Gabe, what do you want for dinner? Pizza. Oh, you hate spaghetti? You anti-spaghetti? You marching against spaghetti? No, I just wanted pizza. I'm not giving any thought to these other things, nor am I trying to push them down or not pay attention to them. And when appropriate, I like spaghetti. I like spaghetti a lot.
You just want to make clear that just because this is not something we're focusing on here, we don't have anything against it, and we support others focusing upon it.
Yeah, we also don't talk about Marvel movies, which I'm obsessed with, but it's not the space for it.
Gabe, your point is that promoting one idea or one approach does not mean that you're bashing another one.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. We could have saved a whole hour. This show could have been 10 minutes. Hey, you're listening to the Not Crazy Podcast. This is Gabe. I'm here with Lisa. Lisa gives a quote. Hey, just because we promote one idea does not mean we're bashing another. There's room for multiple pathways to recovery. We need to be open to things. Yay! All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Psych Central Podcast. Shit.
That would be a very odd show for us to have.
Yeah, this is what happens when you host more than one show. But sincerely, all I want people to know is that personal stories have incredible value. As Rachel established better than we ever could, the power of getting in touch with your past, of sharing it with like-minded people, of, she didn't use these exact words, but of finding your tribe, of making amends with family members. Like, this is what openly discussing our stories can do. And it was sad, Lisa, when we got the emails where people were saying, oh, so you're saying that these stories have no advocacy benefit, or that these stories are not a good idea, or that you don't encourage people to promote their stories. I was very bummed that people got that message. The reality, Lisa, is we need them both. Remember when I testified in front of the General Assembly and here are all these senators, and if I gave them a fact, their eyes glossed over. If I told them about something bad that happened to me because of these laws or lack of resources, then all of a sudden their eyes widened like, oh my, how could this happen to a person? And you and I learned very quickly that the marriage of fact and personal story, the personal story grounds it, the fact gives them an entry point of something to fix. So I am fascinated by this idea that the two things would ever be at odds, given how intrinsically connected in my mind they are. Facts are valuable. Saying what we want is valuable. Advocating for ourselves is valuable. But the reason we do it is always connected to, frankly, something bad, traumatic, or awful that happened to us in the past that we want to ensure doesn't happen to anybody else ever again. And I think that's worth discussing.
Yeah, the personal is political.
Exactly. I just don't think it's worth discussing on this show. Not in a bad way. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's Not Crazy Podcast. Wherever you downloaded the show, please subscribe. Also, rate it, rank it, review it. Use actual letters to form words to tell people why they should listen as well. I am Gabe Howard. I am the author of Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations. You can, of course, get it on Amazon, but if you go to GabeHoward.com right now and buy the book, I will sign it and I will give you a whole bunch of Not Crazy Podcast stickers absolutely free. Don't believe me? Lisa will hold me to it.
Lisa will actually be mailing the books, so no worries. There'll be stickers in there.
Stick around for the outtake at the end of the credits, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
You've been listening to the Not Crazy Podcast from Psych Central. For free mental health resources and online support groups, visit psychcentral.com. Not Crazy's official website is psychcentral.com/notcrazy. To work with Gabe, go to GabeHoward.com. Want to see Gabe and me in person? Not Crazy travels well. Have us record an episode live at your next event. Email show@psychcentral.com for details.
Oh, hey, that is a shorter way to say that.
There's a reason I'm the editor. Oh, that one's good.
No, it's not.
Oh.
The show is still long.
Well, it's not as long as it would be. Do you know how much we record? Oh my God, are you serious?
All right, I'm going to set you up again.
Okay, I didn't know you didn't like that. I liked it.
I don't know why, but that's not funny.
I thought it was funny.
There's a reason why I'm the editor? Why? What's the reason? It's not immediately evident.
Because you talk too much. It's immediately evident.
Well, now it's just mean.
Well,